The separation of powers is a foundational concept in constitutional law, and in fact the pivot for our understanding of how governance in the modern state operates. It's not a new idea, and generally Montesquieu, the French political philosopher, is credited as the person who formulated this doctrine. He proposed that different bodies, called the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, respectively perform different functions, and that different people populating each of these institutions perform these different functions. But before him, John Locke proposed the division of power between the legislature, the executive, and foreign relations. But it was Montesquieu's formulation that stood the test of time, and that forms the Trias Politica as we understand it today. The work, the spirit of the laws, influenced the formulation of the constitutions and the establishment of different branches of state in the United States and in France after the War of Independence and the Revolution, respectively. So, separation of powers in essence requires a distinction, differentiation, teasing out of different functions and functionaries. Governmental function is in accordance with this doctrine thus defined as either legislative, executive, or judicial, and different functionaries populating each of these different organs of state perform these different functions. Now, let's take a closer look at the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, and their particular functions in the modern state. The legislature is that body that represents the interests of the citizens. It is that body that is elected as a result or through a national general election or provincial, local, doesn't matter, but through an election by the citizenry indicating that we would like X or Y political party to stand as our representatives in the legislature. Now, the legislature performs a particular governmental function, or rather, here I have 4 particular important functions performed by the legislature. The first thing is that the legislature acts as a forum for public debate. If something significant happens in a particular society, so for example, there's a grave natural disaster, an economic crisis, or corruption is a problem, or xenophobia is a problem in a particular society, or a health crisis of some form, then that is something that will call the attention of the legislature, who will then engage in debate amongst the members of the political parties present in the legislature with that particular topic. But the legislature doesn't only serve as a point or a place for discussion. It also plays a very important role in, as our representatives, electing officials. A good example of this is thinking of the role of the South African National Assembly, which is one of the Houses of Parliament, and its role in electing the President immediately after a general election, or its role in representing the Speaker. That is done at the or on the authority of the electorate, who gives authority to its representatives in the legislature to do so. And then a third and very important function, particularly in our parliamentary system of government, is that the legislature has the task of keeping the executive accountable. The executive, and we will discuss this in more detail, they are the party political appointees, and in a parliamentary system they are drawn from the legislature. They need the support of the legislature to continue in government. They need to account for the use of taxpayers' money on road improvements, building soccer stadiums, delivering textbooks, not delivering textbooks, school exam results, and so forth. So in that way, through questioning, through interrogating, through calling to account, through insisting on explanations, through insisting on resignations, the legislature can keep the executive accountable. And the last example, or the last task function here that is set out is that of making laws, and that is the one that we generally associate with the legislature. The legislature identifies where there are needs in our legal framework, and they respond to those needs. Generally, it is at the insistence of the executive that they make laws, but they respond by deciding whether this is in the interest of the citizenry, or that, in any case, is how we understand the role of the legislature to be. The executive, we've just come across this term before, the executive is that branch of government, branch of state, that is made up of the party political appointees that attain the majority in an election, and who has on the power to rule on the authority of the people. This is the group of party political appointees who formulates and implements policy in accordance with a mandate from the people. And very importantly, this branch also plays a role in implementing legislation and overseeing the implementation of legislation. Very often, as I've indicated just now, it prepares legislation because it sees in its implementation of legislation where there are gaps or oversights that need to be dealt with. The last branch of government or state, and this is one that is often called the least dangerous branch, is the judiciary. And the judiciary is concerned with the resolution of disputes through the application of law. And these disputes may be between citizens. For example, you and I conclude a contract, I breach the contract, and you take me to court, you sue me in a court of law. That is the judiciary stepping in and resolving the dispute for us. Or I commit a crime, theft or murder, culpable homicide, and I'm prosecuted for that. Then that involves the relationship between the citizen and the state. It could also be a breach of human rights, which involve a relationship between the citizen and the state, if that is the case determined by the facts of the particular matter. Why do we have separation of powers? The idea behind separation of powers is to avoid a concentration of power in one person or one institution. You will recall Lord Acton's remark in his letter to the bishop, where he said that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. If one person has the authority to decide what the rules are, that same person can implement the rules, and the person can resolve disputes regarding that rules. That person has significant power and is quite likely that the power will be abused. In order to avoid that, the doctrine of separation of powers thus prescribes a division of functions and functionaries in order to ensure a maximum individual liberty for the people in the state, and then furthermore also to ensure specialization, since people who are members of the executive will only involve them in those kinds of tasks. People who are in the judiciary will only involve them with judicial tasks, and so forth. Is it possible to have a complete separation? So in other words, that the three branches of government operate like silos, completely independently from one another. That, I think, should be quite evident from our discussion of the initiation of legislation is not possible. There is a constant interaction between the branches of state, and there is a need for interaction between the branches of state. There is a need to ensure that government has adequate power to act in a speedy, effective, efficient manner, but there is also a need to protect the liberty of the individual by limiting governmental power. The formulation of the doctrine of separation of powers, particularly as it is conceptualized and applied in the United States, has become enhanced by the application of the doctrine of checks and balances, which supports separation of powers. Checks and balances are measures of internal control between the different branches of government that have been put in place to enhance accountability. One branch, for example, is given a power, and then another branch is given another power to check or counterbalance the exercise of power by the first branch to ensure accountability. If we look at the example of the United States on the next slide, this will become more evident and clearer. Now, the United States of America, you will recall from our discussion of classification of constitutions, is a presidential system. In other words, there are separate political mandates for the legislature and the executive. In this system, there are specific checks and balances that enhances the different functionaries performing different functions, in that it ensures accountability. So, for example, the president appoints the judges. So the president has a political mandate. Judges do not have a political mandate. The president is the one who decides who sits on the Supreme Court of the Supreme Court of the United States. Once the president has made his nomination, the members of the legislature must approve that appointment. So the president exercises a power, but to ensure accountability in the exercise of power, the legislature also has a role to play. Let's look at the legislative process as another example. Congress makes legislation. Congress decides it wants to spend less money on healthcare because healthcare is far too expensive. The president, and this is a significant power that the president of America has, may veto that legislation. So in other words, he has a power to stop that legislation of coming into force or becoming legislation in the first instance. Another check on the exercise of power comes in the form of judicial review for compliance. So in other words, that the courts have the authority to declare laws unconstitutional. The only overlap within the system of separation of powers in the United States of America, where there is the most pure form of separation that we find, is in the person of the vice president, who is also the chairperson of Senate. If you have any further questions, please bring these to class. Please note that in class we will discuss the application of the doctrine in the South African context, and that will require you to have read the cases so that you can interact with me and ask questions regarding how the separation of powers particularly works in South Africa, and then whether this is appropriate given our particular context. Thank you.